Welcome back. So next thing we're going to take a look at here is starting out with the cerebrum and talking a little bit about the white matter tracts in there. I just didn't want to try to give you too long of a video. We'll start out talking about that, and then what we're going to do is we're going to work our way through some of the other regions of the brain, really the diencephalon and the cerebellum, and then the last episode there really work on the brainstem and the parts of that. So again, we know on the exterior of the brain there is a lot of the gray matter, and connecting that gray matter is going to be the white matter. Within the brain, it is in the interior, and is connecting these different regions of the brain with these myelinated axons. These are going to be in what we call tracts, because groups of axons group together in the central nervous system is what we call a tract. We're going to see that there's a few different types of tracts that I just want you to be able to differentiate. We're not going to be identifying particular ones outside of maybe the corpus callosum, but some of these association tracts, these are tracts that are allowing certain cerebral regions to connect with one another. Association tracts are ones that are staying within the same hemisphere and can be defined by really a couple different things. Incredibly short ones are called arcuate fibers that are connecting really almost stuff that are on the same folds. Longer ones here would be what we call longitudinal fasciculi. These are a little bit further apart, but again, it's within the same hemisphere. So these association tracts will be within the same hemisphere and would be either arcuate fibers or longitudinal fasciculi. So like it said there, an example would be a tract connecting like the Wernicke's area to the motor to the Broca's area, for example. Commissural tracts, these are really connecting one hemisphere to the other. So these commissures is this idea of an axonal bridge. So commissural tracts are crossing over. We talked about the gray commissure on the spinal cord, that connection between the two sides of the spinal cord. In the case of the brain, we have the commissural tracts. The largest one is the corpus callosum. There is some smaller ones a little bit further down as well. But the main one we'll look at, and the one that you'll probably be needing to identify on images of the brain, excuse me, is going to be that corpus callosum. Projection tracts, these are ones that are starting in the brain and are going to be leading the brain to the spinal cord. So regions of the cerebral cortex to things like the midbrain or further down, those are projection tracts, ones that are going from one area to a different area of the brain, completely not staying within the cerebrum, but actually traveling down to other regions of the brain. And this kind of shows you some of those examples. So on the same hemisphere, little connections here, the arcuate, the longer ones, the fascicular ones. You kind of have to switch over to these ones to do a little bit more. So commissural tracts you can see here, and then projection tracts are the ones that are going down and again making their way further down in the brain, and you can see the crossing over of them on a lot of cases there. The next region I want to talk about is the one you really can't see from the outside. That's the diencephalon. Really two main parts that we're going to focus on in this one. There is more parts than that, but we're really going to talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus are probably going to be two key areas that we discuss. I will mention some of the other ones, but those are, to me, the ones that are probably going to end up being the most important to you. This is really a lot of moving stuff from those lower brain regions and being able to send it to different regions of the cerebral cortex. So there's a lot of sensory motor pathways going through here, as well as, at least in terms of the hypothalamus, really doing a lot of work with controlling some of that autonomic nervous system and those visceral activities. So the thalamus, you can see, is underneath this corpus callosum. Is probably the biggest region here. You can see the hypothalamus. Again, when you're looking at the brain on this stuff here, there is not a lot of obvious big structural changes here. It's the main idea of knowing kind of where they're at and some of the basic layout. But you can see some of the different parts it's talking about on this one. We're going to zoom in and kind of do a little bit more on each of the little things here. So you can see the thalamus is going to be this circular structure right here with that little adhesion on this. This is going to be the largest part of the diencephalon. Beneath that is going to be the hypothalamus, which is doing a lot of control of the autonomic nervous system and especially the pituitary gland. And we'll talk about a lot of that as we go. So the epithalamus is actually the roof of this. It's covering part of the third ventricle. It does have the pineal gland on the back side of that, which is one of the... it's involved with sleep-wake cycles, releases melatonin and things like that. Is definitely involved in circadian rhythms and some other functions in terms of the pineal gland. So again, releasing melatonin, the habenular nuclei is really kind of connecting the limbic system with some of the odor response here and some of those emotional responses that you have to your sense of smell. So you can see the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the pituitary underneath that. Like I said, the thalamus is the biggest area on this one. There's actually two halves to it, two hemispheres to it. Simplest way to explain this one is it is a relay station for sensory impulses. So almost all sensory impulses, with the exception of the olfactory senses, are going to be traveling through the thalamus. They are going through a relay in the thalamus and are going to get directed to the correct area. So kind of going in there acts as like a switchboard almost. Filters out, it does kind of put out the biggest stimuli that you need to be paying attention to, and stuff that isn't changing much, like background noise in a cafeteria, like it says there. It does help to filter some of that out. Because it is doing a lot of this, it does influence the basal ganglia, it does influence the cerebellum. And again, we don't know everything that it does, but we know that it is a big sensory switchboard type of station here. The hypothalamus, the easiest way to think about this one is that it is really kind of your homeostasis center of the brain. So this is doing a lot of autonomic function, so controlling a lot of the autonomic nervous system. So with influence in things like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration rate, how dilated your pupils are. It's involved in emotional responses, as well as sex and hunger drive. It's involved in regulating body temperature. It's involved in regulating food intake, involved in water balance, as well as influencing some of the sleep-wake cycles along with the pineal gland. On top of that, it is controlling both the anterior and posterior pituitary. So hypothalamus has a large number of functions. It is something we're going to come back to and honestly spend quite a bit of time talking about in the endocrine system, because really this is the main control region of the endocrine system that is found in the brain. Kind of skirting that line between the diencephalon and the cerebrum is what we call the limbic system. I don't go super deep into this one here. It is dealing a lot with emotion and some of these kind of consciousness to unconsciousness, as well as memory storage and retrieval is some of the different things it's involved in. So the hippocampus involved in memory storage and retrieval. Definitely your fear response, regulated a little bit by the amygdala. We're going to talk about the reticular formation, which is kind of parts of the limbic system, as well as some of the other regions here that is helps you go from unconsciousness to consciousness. So again, knowing the limbic system is involved with emotional states, as well as kind of fear response and memory storage and retrieval is really the key things to me to know about it. Knowing that the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the mammillary body are part of it. So it's a little bit of cerebral structures as well as diencephalon and structures. Cingulate gyrus is one of these ones that takes other parts, coordinates parts of the limbic system. Not one that that you see as much. The hippocampal gyrus is, the parahippocampal gyrus is above the hippocampus, located in the temporal lobe. The hippocampus to me is kind of one of the key things here. This is involved in taking stuff from short-term and facilitating its movement into long-term memory, as well as retrieval of stuff from long-term memory. To me, one of the more important parts. Same thing with the amygdala and the amygdala or the amygdaloid body. It's connected to the hippocampus, really involved with emotions, especially fear. This is really triggered in fear responses, and is emotional context of memories is going to be involved in that storage. Olfactory bulbs and tracts do travel through this, which a lot of times leads to the generalization that odors can provoke emotions a little bit more strongly than a lot of some of your other senses. And then really the last part here, the tract of white matter that's kind of underneath that corpus callosum is going to be this fornix. And again, this is connecting the hippocampus to some of these other limbic structures that are important to us. Like I said, the reticular formation is something I mentioned here. It is found in parts, kind of certain parts of all these parts of the brain here. It's like I said, there's a little core of gray matter that's going through this, communicates with the spinal cord. Really, to me, the biggest thing on this one is it's a lot involved in going from unconsciousness to consciousness, and the fact that you are able to respond to stimuli when you are not conscious in terms of like sleeping. This is involved in that, and taking some of those things like an alarm clock and taking that from sleeping to awake. So really, evolutionarily, it was an important thing in that when you were sleeping, if you heard a stick break, that would be enough to bring you back to consciousness. Because again, if you sleep so soundly you get eaten by a lion, then you're not going to last that long. Like I said, the sensory components of this are what they call the reticular activating system. And to me, that's the important thing here. Processing some of those stimuli that keeps you alert, as well as can take you from a sleep state to an awake state by triggering some of this information. And consciousness is just this idea of being aware of your surroundings and being able to control voluntary movements. And it is on, like I said, that continuation or continuum from being sleeping to fully alert. Again, some of this cortical activity of the cerebrum is depressed during sleep. A lot of the functions in the brainstem continue to go on. But this is kind of, again, showing you that reticular activating system and how it is parts of the brainstem and midbrain and cerebral cortex.